The light that January evening was the color of copper, a color that did not belong to winter. The air had gone still in a way that erased sound. No wind through the grass, no creak from the fence wire, no crows. Snow softened on south-facing slopes. Eaves dripped. Men in town removed their coats and called it mercy. Behind a 12 by 14-foot shack at the edge of the settlement, a woman stood at the mouth of a hole cut into a clay hillside. She was not looking at the sky. She was looking at the darkness inside the bank, where a passage she had dug with a pickaxe and a borrowed auger led into the earth. The woodpile beside the shack held less than a cord. Arvid Vangen died on a Tuesday in September, 3 weeks after a hay blade opened his palm to the bone. The cut looked like nothing. Beret washed it with vinegar and wrapped it in boiled cloth while Arvid laughed and said he had bled worse pulling barbed wire for a neighbor's fence. By Thursday, the hand was swollen past the wrist. By Saturday, the red line had climbed past his elbow and Arvid stopped laughing. The doctor's wagon came from 14 miles south and cost $3 before burial costs, and when the man looked at the arm, he did not even open his bag. He said the word sepsis the way a minister says ashes. Beret buried her husband on a Friday. The ground was still soft enough to dig without a bar. She wore her one dark dress and stood alone because no one in the Spring Creek settlement knew her well enough to stand beside her, and no one liked Arvid well enough to pretend. He had been a quiet man who filed on 160 acres of southwestern Dakota territory because the Homestead Act said he could, and who died before the land proved whether he was right to try. The claim was hers now. A widow could hold a homestead filing. The law allowed it even if the neighbors did not. 160 acres of short grass, clay bank, and wind. A 12 by 14-foot shack built of cottonwood frame and tar paper patches that Arvid had meant to finish in spring. A cracked stoveplate that leaked smoke when the damper stuck. A brindle cow named Meta who gave milk whether the world made sense or not. And a note. Orson Vale had come 2 days after the burial with a ledger under his arm and a face arranged for sympathy. He was a freight hauler, small lender, and buyer of claims that grief made cheap. He had extended credit for flour, coffee, a stove patch, and roofing nails. He had written the note so that payment came due before spring filing, which meant Beret owed him before the government owed her the land. He left the paper on her table and tapped the claim map tacked to the wall. She had $12.40. The note was for $9.70, plus interest that grew like the red line on Arvid's arm. By October, frost feathered the nail heads inside the north wall of the shack. Beret could see her breath before the stove caught each morning, and by noon, the tar paper on the west side popped and crackled where wind found the seams. She counted her wood the way a sick man counts heartbeats. 1 cord and a quarter of mixed cottonwood and scrub oak, stacked against the south wall where it caught what little protection the shack offered. Some of it was green, some of it was punky at the center and would burn fast and give back nothing. She did not know how much wood a Dakota winter demanded. She had wintered once in Decorah, Iowa, in a proper frame house with a husband and a coal stove, and neighbors who shared news about weather. That winter had been a borrowed life. This one would be hers alone. The answer came walking up the track on a cold morning in late October, wearing a canvas coat and the expression of a man who has seen enough failure to recognize its early shape. Abner Clegg was 61 years old, a former Army teamster who had hauled supplies on the Bozeman Trail before the forts closed. He had survived 3 Plains winters in structures worse than Beret's shack, and he had buried men who thought surviving one winter meant they understood the next. He was the settlement's self-appointed authority on cold, and when younger men asked how much wood they needed, he gave the same answer he had given for a decade: more than you think, and then more again. He did not knock. He opened the door, looked at the stove, looked at the frost on the nail heads, walked to the north wall and pressed his palm against it. His hand came away damp. "How much wood do you have?" Clegg said. "A cord and a quarter," Beret said. Clegg lifted the stove lid with 2 fingers and looked at the crack in the plate where smoke escaped sideways instead of rising. He set the lid back without comment. "A shack like this," Clegg said, "with walls that breathe and a stove that leaks, Needs 5 cords to carry you through a gentle winter. 6 if the winter is hard. You have wood enough for March if this were April. Beret asked what she should do. Sell the cow, Clegg said. Buy wood. Pray the cow forgives you. Meta stood in the lean-to behind the shack, her breath fogging in the half-light, her ribs showing less than Beret's. The cow gave milk. Milk meant food through winter and barter in spring. Selling Meta was not a solution. It was trading a slow death for a different slow death. If I sell the cow, Beret said, I eat the winter, but I do not eat the spring. Clegg shrugged. Spring is a problem for people who survive winter. He left without offering help. That was not cruelty. That was Clegg's understanding of the world. You told people the math, and the math either moved them or buried them. He had watched it work both ways. Beret stood in the shack after he left and looked at the north wall. She could see the places where frost had melted under Clegg's palm and was already forming again, tiny crystals reaching inward like fingers. The wall did not hold cold out. It invited cold in and offered warmth in exchange, a trade that never balanced. She could chop more wood. The nearest draw with standing timber was 2 miles south, across open ground that drifted shut after every storm. She could drag deadfall on Arvid's hand sled, alone, spending a full day for a load that would burn in 2 nights. The math did not work. Every day spent hauling wood was a day the wood she had shrank against the cold, and every load she brought back was already too small. She could buy coal. But the rail line to Rapid City was unreliable in winter. Coal prices doubled after November, and she had $12 to last until spring. Coal was for people with money or credit, and Orson Vale had made sure her credit was a leash, not a lifeline. She could move to town. But leaving the claim for more than 6 months forfeited it, and forfeiting the claim meant the note followed her with nothing to show for Arvid's death, and her brother's passage debt back in Iowa stayed unpaid. The claim was not just land. It was the only arithmetic that made her life add up. She could board with neighbors. Nils Moen and his wife lived a mile north in a proper sod house with 2 children and enough provisions to be generous if they chose. But boarding meant dependence, and dependence meant debt of a kind that could not be written in a ledger. Women who boarded with families became labor. They cooked, cleaned, minded children, and lost their names. They became the woman staying with the Moens, and when spring came they had survived but owned nothing, not even the winter they had endured. Every sensible option cost the claim. Beret stood in the shack and felt the wall breathe cold against her back, and she did not know yet what she would do, but she knew what she would not do. She would not sell Meta. She would not leave. That left a question she could not answer. How do you survive a winter when you cannot make enough fire? Sin. The answer did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as water. 3 days after Clegg's visit, Beret tried his advice halfway. She walked to the draw with the hand sled, spent 4 hours cutting deadfall and dragging it across frozen grass, and returned with a load so small it fit in the crook of her arm. Her hands were cracked inside her mittens. Her ribs ached where she had braced the sled rope across her chest. The cottonwood was half rotten and would burn like paper. She opened the shack door, and the wind came in behind her like a guest who had been waiting. It crossed the room in a straight line and found the stove, and the smoke that should have risen through the pipe instead leaned sideways and spilled through the cracked plate into the room. Beret coughed and shut the door, but the damage was already done. The room's small store of warmth had left through the open door in the time it took to step inside. The shack did not lack fire. She had burned 3 armloads that day, more than she could afford, and the room was still cold enough to see her breath near the north wall. The fire was not the problem. The walls were the problem. The seams were the problem. The door was the problem. The stove crack was the problem. Every surface that touched the outside air was a thief, and the fire was paying ransom it could never satisfy. That night she spilled water near the back threshold. The threshold was where the rear wall of the shack pressed against the clay bank that rose behind it, a low hill that climbed 8 or 9 feet above the roofline. Arvid had built the shack against the bank because the bank blocked north wind, but he had not sealed the joint between wall and earth, and cold air pooled along the floor where the two met. In the morning, the spilled water had frozen in a lace pattern. The crystals pointed toward the door cracks, tracing the path of moving air like a map drawn by the cold itself. Beret followed the pattern with her eyes. The ice was thickest near the door. It thinned toward the bank wall. Near the clay, where the bank pressed against the shack's rear boards, the water had not frozen at all. It sat in a shallow puddle, cold but liquid. She went outside and checked the crock she had tucked against the clay bank 2 days earlier, a stoneware jug she used for buttermilk when the weather cooperated. The crock sat in a shallow niche where the bank curved, sheltered from wind on 3 sides by earth. The water inside was slushed at the rim but liquid at the center. She pressed her hand against the clay bank. It was cold. But it was not the same cold as the air. The air bit. The clay held. It did not give warmth, but it did not steal warmth either. It sat at a temperature that seemed to belong to a different day, a slower day, a day that had not yet caught up with the night's killing frost. Beret stood with her hand on the bank and remembered a sound. Not a word, not a lesson, but the specific low thud of her mother's palm against a turf wall in Norway. She had been 8, maybe 9, standing in the byre beneath the farmhouse while her mother checked the cows before milking. The byre was dug into the hillside, walls of turf and stone, ceiling of timber and sod, the cows below and the family above. In January, the wind outside could kill a lamb in an hour, but the byre air smelled of warm hide and hay and old smoke, and when Beret's mother pressed her hand against the turf wall, she said a thing Beret had carried without understanding for 20 years. "The wall keeps yesterday," her mother said. She meant that the earth did not follow the weather. The earth remembered the temperature of the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that. It changed slowly, like a grandmother who refuses to rush. When the air above plunged to killing cold, the earth beneath still held the memory of a warmer time, and anything sheltered by that earth borrowed that memory. Beret did not think in the language of thermal mass or heat transfer. She thought in the language of touch, open air bit. Sod walls did not. The bank behind her shack was not a wall. It was a hill of clay and grass roots 6 feet thick, and it held yesterday the same way her mother's byre had held yesterday, the same way root cellars held yesterday, the same way the dead held the warmth of living until the earth finally claimed it. She did not need more fire. She needed a wall that winter could not enter. That evening, she drew on a flour sack with a charcoal stick. The design was not a house. It was not even a proper dugout, the kind she had seen described in land office pamphlets, where a family carved a full room into a hillside and lived under sod. She did not have time for a dugout. She did not have lumber for a dugout. She had one idea, and maybe 10 days before deep winter locked the ground. What she drew was a passage. A short tunnel cut horizontally into the clay bank behind the shack, with a low doorway broken through the shack's rear wall, a raised sill to keep meltwater from running inside, and a log and sod roof. At the far end, the passage widened into a small chamber, just large enough to store watercrocks, root vegetables, bedding, and emergency fodder for the cow. The aim was not to live underground. The aim was to give the shack a second wall that did not breathe, a buffer between the living space and the killing wind, a room made of earth that would hold yesterday's temperature while the air outside raced toward death. She measured the passage in her mind, 4 feet high, 5 feet wide, 9 feet deep. The chamber at the end would widen to 7 by 6 feet, with a ceiling of 4.5 feet at the center. She could not stand upright in it. She would not need to. It was not a room for living. It was a room for surviving. The next morning, she took the iron rod Arvid had used for fence posts and drove it into the bank at 3 heights. At the surface, the clay was frozen hard, and the rod rang against it. 2 feet in, the clay softened and the rod sank with effort. 3 feet in, the clay resisted again, but with the slow push of density, not the brittleness of frost. The frost line sat at roughly 2 feet. Below that, the earth was cold but workable. She would start her cut below the frost line and work upward into the softer clay. She rolled a piece of clay between her fingers, pressing it into a coil the thickness of her thumb. It bent twice before cracking. Good clay. No tight that would powder, not sand that would slump, but the dense gray stuff that held its shape when you asked it to. She studied the bank's face. It angled southeast, catching morning sun and shedding north wind. Historical dugout builders had chosen south-facing banks for exactly this reason, and Beret knew it not from books, but from the buyer in Norway, which had faced the same way for the same purpose. She refused to dig downward. Water collected in low places, and a flooded tunnel was worse than a cold shack. She would dig slightly upward into the bank, with the floor sloping 1 inch for every 6 feet toward the outside, so that any water that entered would walk itself back out through a shallow drainage trench. She picked up the pickaxe on a Monday morning and swung it into the bank for the first time. The sound carried across frozen ground like a gunshot. Nils Moen heard it first. He was mending fence a quarter-mile north when the rhythmic striking reached him, and he stopped with the wire in his hands and listened. It sounded like someone driving post, but the tempo was wrong. Post driving was spaced, deliberate. This was steady, almost frantic, the sound of someone cutting into something that fought back. He found Beret at the base of the clay bank behind her shack, swinging the pick in short arcs because the space was too tight for a full swing. She had cut a notch into the bank about 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, and loose clay lay in a heap at her boots. Her breath came in bursts. Her coat was open despite the cold because the work had heated her past comfort. Niels watched for a moment before speaking. He was 36, Norwegian, a practical man with a wife, 2 children, and a sod house that worked because sod houses had worked on the plains for 20 years. He was not cruel. He was not a man who enjoyed watching people fail. But he was a man who believed that survival came from doing what had been proven, and what Beret was doing had not been proven by anyone he knew. "What are you building?" Niels said. Beret told him. She described the passage, the chamber, the earth buffer. She said the back wall of her shack lost heat faster than the stove could replace it, and she meant to give the shack a second back wall made of 6 feet of clay and grass root that the wind could not reach. Niels looked at the notch in the bank. He looked at the shack. He looked at Beret's hands, which were blistered across the palms, even through cloth wraps. "Clay is not lumber, Beret," he said. "It does not warn before it comes down." Beret said, "Lumber warned me all December. It said it could not hold heat." "Then patch the lumber," Niels said. "With what money?" Niels stood there a moment longer. He had the look of a man calculating something he did not want to calculate, which was the chance that this woman would be dead by January, and the chance that it would be partly his fault for not stopping her. "Earth sweats," he said. "In a closed space, the moisture freezes on whatever is coldest, and that will be your bedding and your lungs. Clay falls without sound. You will not hear the roof give, and smoke in a tunnel has nowhere to go but into you." Every concern was valid. Beret heard them the way a builder hears an inspector, not as reasons to stop, but as problems that needed answers. Moisture meant she needed ventilation. Clay fall meant she needed an arch, not flat walls. Smoke meant she needed a draft path that did not depend on the tunnel mouth. "I hear you," Beret said. "I do not agree, but I hear you." Niels left. He walked back to his fence and finished the wire, and that evening he told his wife that the Vangen woman was digging a grave behind her shack and calling it a house. His wife said nothing, because women who filed alone were either brave or doomed, and she had learned that telling the difference took longer than a winter. The sound of Beret's pick carried for 3 days. 2 boys from the Tolliver claim repeated it at the general store, swinging sticks and miming a grave digger while their father bought coffee. By evening, the joke had reached men who had never walked within a mile of Beret's shack. "She's digging her own grave and saving us the trouble." The words belonged to no one and everyone. They moved through the settlement the way weather moved, arriving without warning and settling into the cracks between people. At the store, men shook their heads. At the Moen kitchen, Niels repeated what he had seen, and his wife said that a woman without help will try what a woman with help would never need. Orson Vale heard the joke and sharpened it into a tool. He He stood near the stove at the general store on a Thursday afternoon, warming his hands and wearing the face of a man burdened by public duty. Vale was 44, broad across the chest, with a voice that carried without effort because he had spent years making sure every room heard him. He hauled freight. He lent money. He bought claims from people whose grief or failure made them grateful for any price. He held Beret's note, and he held the patience to wait, because the land she filed on included a good spring seep and a sheltered bank valuable for livestock, and he meant to have it by spring. The county should not let fools freeze on land. Useful men could work, Vale said, loud enough for the room. No one argued. Arguing with Vale cost more than silence. She is making a death pit, he continued. She is cutting into a wet bank with no bracing, no timber, no partner, and no plan that a sane person would recognize. When the clay comes down on her, the county will have to send men to dig her out, and those men will have their own work to do. He paused for effect, then added the offer he had been building toward all along. I would take the claim off her hands now, before winter makes the paperwork cruel. He said it like charity. He meant it like a wolf counting sheep. Beret entered the store the next day to buy lamp wick. She needed light. The days were shortening and the tunnel work pushed past dusk, and without a lamp she would be cutting blind into clay she could not see. The store went quiet when she walked in. Not hostile quiet, but the quiet of people who have been talking about someone and have not yet decided what face to wear. Vale was still there. He seemed to live at the store in winter, a permanent fixture near the heat, dispensing judgment and credit in equal measure. He turned when Beret entered and produced a smile that looked like it cost him effort. "Beret," he said, "I hear you have been busy." "I need lamp wick," Beret said. "I hear you are improving your land," Vale said. "Digging, that is ambitious for one woman alone." Beret said nothing. She placed her coins on the counter and waited for the storekeeper. Vale stepped closer. "No shame in admitting land beat you," he said. "I would give you $1 for the cow today in front of witnesses. You could ride to Rapid City by week's end." $1 for a cow worth 8. The offer was not charity. It was the price a vulture pays for meat it did not kill. "Land has not spoken yet," Beret said. "Only men have." The room stayed quiet. The storekeeper wrapped the wick slowly, as if hoping someone would change the subject. Beret paid and left. She learned later that the storekeeper had refused to extend additional credit, not because he doubted her character, but because Vale's opinion traveled through the settlement like cold through plank walls, and a man who extended credit to a woman Vale had marked for failure was a man who would find his own freight rates increased by spring. The cost of mockery was not just words. It was wick she could not buy, credit she could not get, neighbors who looked away when she passed because helping her risked angering men who owed Vale money. Women avoided her because their husbands owed Vale. Men avoided her because her failure would confirm what they already believed about women who filed alone. The Homestead Act allowed women to claim land. It did not require anyone to believe they should. Beret returned to the shack and trimmed her remaining wick to a stub. She would work by what light remained in the day, and when the day ended she would stop, and when the day came again she would start, and she would do this until the tunnel was finished or the weather finished her. She picked up the axe the next morning and swung it into the bank. The clay had frozen deeper overnight, and the first strike rang off the surface without cutting. She adjusted her angle, aiming below the frost line, and the second strike bit. Clay crumbled in chunks the size of her fist. She shoveled it out, stacked it beside the entrance, and swung again. By midday she had cut 4 feet into the bank. The passage was ragged, the walls uneven, the ceiling too flat. She had shaped it like a box because a box was what she knew, and a box was what the pick wanted to make. The clay at the ceiling looked solid, but she could see a hairline crack running lengthwise, the kind of line that meant nothing until it meant everything. She did not see the slump coming. The warm spell that afternoon softened the top layer of the bank, and water that had frozen in the clay above her cut began to thaw and seep downward, loosening the bond between layers. The ceiling did not crack. It sagged. A chunk of clay the size of a feed sack separated from the roof and fell across the pick handle, driving it into Beret's ribs on the left side. She went down on her hands and knees. The pain was a bright, hard thing that filled her chest and left no room for air. She could not breathe in, and she could not breathe out, and for a long moment the world was just the sound of loose clay ticking down around her, and the smell of wet earth, and the color of darkness at the edges of her vision. She lay still. Clay dust settled on her back. She heard a sound like dry rice falling and knew that more clay was shifting above her, each grain a vote on whether the ceiling held or dropped. The ceiling held. Not because it was strong, but because the slump had relieved the pressure at the weakest point and the remaining clay had nothing left to push it. Beret crawled backward out of the passage on her elbows, dragging the pick behind her, and stood in the cold air gasping until the pain in her ribs subsided to a dull, spreading ache. She looked at the passage. The fallen clay had left a ragged scar on the ceiling, and the walls on either side had cracked where the weight shifted. She had cut square because square was simple, and the clay had told her that simple was wrong. Beret pressed her hand against her ribs and studied the damage. She thought about Neil's moan's warning. She thought about Vale's offer. She thought about the $12.40 that stood between her and the loss of everything Arvid had died for. Then she picked up the shovel and began clearing the fallen clay from the passage. She would not cut square again, but she did not yet know what shape to cut instead. If you have ever been told your work was foolish by someone who never picked up a shovel, tell us about it in the comments. The sound of the pick started again the next morning. Slower this time and careful, each strike testing the clay before committing to the cut. Beret worked with her left arm pressed against her ribs and her right arm swinging short arcs that barely dented the bank. The passage grew by inches instead of feet. She counted each inch because counting was better than thinking, and thinking led to math she could not afford to do. By the end of the first full day of careful work, she had cleared the fallen debris and added 2 feet to the passage. 4 feet total. The walls were still too square, still too flat at the ceiling, but she had begun to angle her cuts inward, trying by instinct to create a curve that would carry weight downward instead of hanging it in the air. The instinct was right. The execution was rough. She could feel the difference between clay that leaned on its neighbors and clay that hung alone, waiting for an excuse to drop, but she could not articulate the principle, and she could not make the pick obey what her hands felt. Her ribs told her when to stop. The first swing of each morning was the worst, a bright flare across her left side that made her eyes water and her grip loosen on the handle. By the 10th swing, the pain dulled to a deep ache she could work around. By the 50th swing, she could not feel it at all, which worried her more than the pain itself, because numbness meant either healing or damage she would pay for later. She cleared clay with the shovel and stacked it in a low wall at the base of the bank, not because she wanted a wall, but because it was the closest place to put the dirt, and every step she did not take was energy she could not spare. The pile grew. It was the only thing about the project that was growing fast enough. On the second day, she broke the shovel handle. The wood was ash, dried too fast and checked along the grain, and it snapped at the socket when she pried a slab of frozen clay from the floor. She stood in the passage, holding 2 pieces of shovel, and said a word in Norwegian that her mother would have answered with silence. She mended the handle with wire and rawhide. The repair held, but the shovel flexed at the joint, and every load she lifted twisted slightly, sending clay off the blade and back onto her boots. Small inefficiency, small waste of motion. But small waste multiplied in a life where nothing could be wasted, and by evening her back ached from compensating for the tool that would not do its job straight. The wood count mattered every night. She burned 2 armloads on the first day of construction and woke to frost on the inside of her blanket. She burned 1.5 armloads on the second day by banking the stove early and sleeping in her coat. The shack was cold enough to crack the skin on her knuckles, but the rear wall, the wall that pressed against the bank, was warmer than the front by a margin she could feel with her palm. The passage was working. Not finished, not proven, not anything a sane person would call shelter. But the fact that she had opened the bank and the bank was breathing slower than the air was a signal she could read. 1 cord and 1/8 of wood remained. The number sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe. On the third morning, she found that the passage ceiling had shifted overnight. Not fallen, shifted. A crack she had not noticed had widened by the thickness of a knife blade, and clay dust lay on the passage floor in a line that traced the crack's path. The ceiling was thinking about falling. It was making its calculations the way clay does, slowly, measuring moisture and weight and the angle of the cut, and it had not yet decided. Beret looked at the crack and understood that she was building something that could kill her, and that the difference between shelter and grave was a knowledge she did not have. She could feel what the clay wanted. She could not give it what it wanted. The gap between sensing and doing was the gap between living and being buried, and she could not close it alone. She needed someone who knew how clay behaved under weight. She needed someone who had stood inside earth-sheltered spaces and understood why some held and others fell. She needed someone who would look at her ragged passage and see not a fool's grave but a mistake that could be corrected. The settlement had made it clear that help was not coming. Niels thought she was reckless. Clegg thought she was doomed. Vale hoped she was both. The women kept their distance because their husbands kept their distance, and sympathy without action was a currency that bought nothing in a Dakota winter. But the sound of the pick carried. It crossed the frozen ground and reached the road, and the road carried it past the Moen claim and the Tolliver claim and the store where men warmed their hands and shook their heads. It reached ears that listened differently than Niels Moen's or Orson Vale's, ears that had heard that sound before, in other winters, in other places where women and men cut into hillsides because the alternative was freezing above ground. Someone was coming who had built root cellars in clay that wept and sawed roofs that held a man's weight. Someone who had delivered babies in dugouts, where the stovepipe was the only proof of a house beneath the snow. Someone who would look at the crack in Beret's ceiling and know whether it was a warning or a sentence. The temperature dropped 3 degrees that night. Beret burned 2 armloads of wood and woke to frost on her blanket. 1 cord and 1/8 remained. Clegg's math echoed in the dark. Wood enough for March, if this were April. It was the first week of November, and the wind had not yet remembered what it could do. Ragna Lund arrived on foot, carrying a canvas sack and a willow walking stick she used more for poking soil than for balance. She was 58 years old, thin through the shoulders, with hands that had delivered babies, built root cellars, and mixed plaster from lime and sand in 3 different territories. Her left wrist was crooked where a break had healed badly 10 years ago, and she could not swing an axe or a pick for more than a few minutes before the bones complained. But her eyes worked. Her memory worked. And she had spent 40 years living inside the earth in one form or another, from the turf-roofed byres of Telemark to the sod houses and dugouts of the northern plains. She had heard the pick. She had heard the joke. She had heard them in that order, and the order mattered because a woman who started digging before the men started laughing was a woman who had reasons that preceded opinion. She found Beret inside the passage, one hand pressed to her ribs, the other hand running along the crack in the ceiling. Loose clay dusted Beret's hair and shoulders. The passage smelled of wet earth and old sweat and the faint sourness of a body working past its limits. Ragna did not offer sympathy. She did not ask if Beret was hurt. She stood at the mouth of the passage and looked at the walls, the ceiling, the floor, the angle of the cut, the pile of debris, and the crack. She looked the way a doctor looks at a wound, not with alarm, but with measurement. "What did you learn?" Ragna said. Beret looked at her. She had expected another warning, another version of Niels's concern or Clegg's arithmetic. She had not expected a question. "It fell where I cut square," Beret said. Ragna nodded once. She entered the passage, crouching because the ceiling was too low for standing, and pressed her thumb into the clay above the crack. She scraped with her nail and watched how the clay curled. She spat on the wall and watched how the moisture spread. "The clay is good," Ragna said. "Dense. It wants to hold, but you told it to hang instead of lean, and clay does not hang." Beret said she did not understand. Ragna picked up a clod of fallen clay and held it between her palms. "A flat ceiling is a plank," she said. "It holds only because something holds it. Wood holds because it bends. Clay does not bend. It breaks. But an arch holds because everything pushes against everything else, and nothing hangs alone. You need to cut shoulders. She traced an invisible curve in the air with her crooked wrist. The roof must lean into the walls, and the walls must lean into the floor, and the floor must lean into the ground beneath it. Everything carries everything. I do not know how to cut an arch with a pickaxe, Beret said. No, Ragna said, but I can show you. This was how the partnership began, not with charity, not with pity, not with the false warmth of a neighbor who helps because guilt is cheaper than grief. Ragna saw something in Beret that mattered to her, a woman who had looked at a failure and asked what it taught instead of who to blame. That quality was rarer than kindness and more useful than money, and Ragna had spent enough years watching people die from ignorance disguised as courage to know the difference between a fool and a student. Ragna's backstory emerged through work, not exposition. As they cut, she talked. She had grown up under turf roofs in Telemark, where the hillside farms were half underground, and the cows lived below the kitchen floor and heated the house with their breathing. She had crossed to America with a husband named Embret, who built root cellars for German-Russian farmers in the James River Valley, digging into bluffs and banking earth against stone walls so that potatoes and beets and crocks of milk could survive the winter without freezing. Embret died of cholera in 1882, and Ragna had continued alone, midwifing and advising and building small things that kept food alive through cold. She had delivered babies in dugouts where the stovepipe was the only proof a house existed beneath the snow. She knew the difference between clay that stood and clay that waited to fall, and she knew it the way a midwife knows the difference between a labor that is progressing and one that has stalled. The first teaching was shape. Ragna made Beret stop digging the main passage and cut a test niche instead. A small alcove, 2 feet deep and 2 feet wide, cut into the bank beside the passage entrance. Ragna showed Beret where to angle the pick, not straight in, but slightly upward at the ceiling line, shaving the clay back so the roof curved into the walls like the inside of a bowl turned sideways. The shoulders, the points where the ceiling met the walls, had to be rounded, not sharp. Sharp corners concentrated weight into a single line, and a single line was where clay cracked. Rounded shoulders distributed weight into a curve, and a curve was what clay wanted to be. Beret cut the niche that afternoon. It was ugly. The curve was uneven, and one shoulder was higher than the other. But when she stepped back and looked at it, she could see the difference between the niche and the passage. The niche looked like it was leaning on the hillside. The passage looked like it was hanging from it. They left the niche overnight. In the morning, it had not moved. No dust on the floor, no crack at the shoulders, no shift in the clay. Ragna pressed her thumb into the ceiling and nodded. Now you have permission to continue, Ragna said. The second teaching was timber. They could not roof the passage with clay alone. The arch helped, but 9 feet of horizontal tunnel needed cribbing, cross pieces that braced the roof at intervals like ribs in a chest. Ragna looked at Beret's remaining lumber and shook her head. Cottonwood was soft. It bent under load and rotted when wet. But cottonwood was what they had. Beret salvaged poles from a broken corral behind the lean-to. Each pole was 5 to 6 inches thick, crooked but sound. Ragna taught her to notch saddles with an axe, shallow V-cuts where cross pieces could sit without rolling. The technique was simple, but the execution required precision that Beret's aching ribs made difficult. Each notch had to be deep enough to grip the cross piece and shallow enough not to weaken the pole. Too deep, and the pole would crack under weight. Too shallow, and the cross piece would roll off under pressure. They placed the first crib set at 3 feet in, the second at 6 feet, and the third at the chamber mouth at 9 feet. Between the poles, they laid willow brush, then hay, then sod slabs cut grass side down, then loose earth packed tight. The roof became a layered thing, each layer doing a different job. Poles for structure, brush for spacing, hay for insulation, sod for weight and weather, earth for mass. This was how dugout roofs had been built across the plains for decades, and Ragna knew the recipe the way a baker knows bread. The third teaching was water. Ragna forced Beret to stop digging and spend half a day cutting a shallow drainage trench from the passage mouth downhill away from the shack. Beret protested. Half a day was half a day's worth of tunnel she would not dig, and November was eating the calendar the way a stove eats wood. Ragna poured a dipper of water on the passage floor and watched it pool. The water sat. It did not move. It had nowhere to go because Beret had cut the floor flat, and flat floors in clay tunnels became ponds in spring and ice sheets in winter. Water is patient, Ragna said, more patient than cold. Beret dug the trench. She sloped the passage floor 1 inch for every 6 feet, just enough for gravity to move water without making the footing treacherous. It cost 4 hours. It felt like waste. Ragna watched her work and said nothing, because the lesson was not in the words but in the doing, and a woman who dug a drainage trench when she wanted to dig a tunnel was a woman who understood that survival was made of the parts you wanted to skip. Progress came in measurable increments, each one counted against the calendar. Day 1 with Ragna. Beret reshaped the existing 4 feet of passage, cutting back the square corners into rough shoulders, reinforcing the cracked section with the first crib set. Her ribs screamed through every overhead strike. She wrapped them with a torn flour sack pulled tight and worked until her hands shook. Day 2. They advanced to 6 feet. The clay changed character 2 feet deeper, denser, darker, with thin seams of sand that Ragna tested by rubbing between her fingers. Sand drains, Ragna said, but it does not hold. She made Beret cut wider at the sand seams, removing the weak material and letting the dense clay above bridge the gap. Second crib set placed. Beret's hands were blistered through the cloth wraps, and the blisters had broken and bled and dried into a crust that cracked each morning when she gripped the pick handle. Day 3. 8 feet. The clay test niche from the first day still held. The arched ceiling in the main passage showed no new cracks. Stove smoke no longer pulled as hard through the rear wall because the passage was blocking wind that had previously found the seams between wall and bank. This was the first measurable evidence that the idea worked. The smoke line in the stovepipe straightened, and the shack held heat 15 minutes longer after banking the fire. Day 4. 9 feet. The passage was complete. Beret widened the far end into a chamber 7 feet by 6 feet, with a ceiling of 4.5 feet at the center arch. The third crib set went in at the chamber mouth. She cut the inner doorway through the shack's rear wall with an axe, framing it with salvaged boards, and raising the sill 4 inches above the passage floor so that meltwater would have to climb uphill to enter the shack. Remaining work. The second plank door at the shack side, sod ceiling around the frame, the drainage trench extension, a vent hole, and a cow partition at the chamber's far wall. The setbacks came between the progress, each one stealing time that could not be replaced. A warm spell softened the top layer of the bank and caused the roof to seep at the entrance. Ragna showed Beret how to pack the sod cap tighter and angle the surface earth away from the tunnel mouth so meltwater ran downhill instead of soaking through. Half a day lost. Meta the cow broke through the lean-to fence and ate the hay Beret had set aside for tunnel roofing. Beret found the animal standing in the hay pile with a mouthful of her roof insulation, chewing with the blank contentment of a creature that understood nothing about deadlines. She replaced the hay with dry grass cut from a nearby draw, which was thinner and less insulating but available. Niels Moan refused to lend poles when Beret asked. He stood at his fence line with his hands in his pockets and said he could not spare the timber, which was true, and that he did not want to encourage a project he thought was dangerous, which was also true. But the next morning, Beret found 2 crooked cottonwood poles leaning against her woodpile, still warm from the saw, with no note and no footprint she could follow. She used them without comment. Niels said nothing about them when she saw him next. This was how help worked in a settlement where opinion was public but conscience was private. Vale sent a boy to count Beret's woodpile. The boy was 12, a Tolliver child, and he walked around the pile slowly, counting armloads the way Vale had taught him. He reported the number to Vale, and Vale repeated it at the store. 1 cord and a little more, for a woman in a tar paper shack with a cracked stove and a hole in the back wall. The number was meant to prove Beret's foolishness. Instead, it started a clock that everyone in the settlement could hear. Abner Clegg returned. He came on the 5th day, after the passage was cut but before the chamber was sealed. He walked around the bank, looking at the drainage trench, the sod cap, the vent hole that Kittel Lundi, Ragna's teenage nephew, had bored with a borrowed auger the day before. Kittel was 17, thin and eager, and he had arrived with the auger and a desire to be useful that exceeded his experience. The vent shaft angled upward through the bank at a steep pitch, capped with a tin scrap wired over the opening to keep snow out. It was not elegant. It answered the smoke concern that Niels had raised, giving stale air a path upward and outward without opening the passage mouth. Clegg inspected the shaft. He inspected the crib sets. He entered the passage and touched the arched ceiling, running his hand along the curve the way he had run his hand along the frost on the north wall weeks earlier. His face was unreadable. "This is not a dugout," Clegg said. "No," Beret said. "A proper dugout is a house. This is a hole tied to a bad cabin." "I did not need a new house in one day," Beret said. "I needed one wall that winter cannot enter." Clegg stared at her. He was a man who respected competence and distrusted innovation, and Beret's passage was both at once. The crib work was sound. The arch was rough but functional. The drainage was better than half the dugouts he had seen in 30 years. But the concept offended him because it was not what he knew, and what he knew had kept him alive. And a man who has survived by doing one thing does not easily accept that another thing might also work. "Any fool can be warm when the wind rests," Clegg said. He turned and left. The wind had been resting. November had been mild, the kind of false autumn that made men talk about easy winters and tempted children to walk without heavy wraps. The sky was high and pale and still. But Ragna watched the chickens in the yard and noticed they had stopped scratching 3 days ago. They stood in clusters near the coop wall, feathers puffed, facing south. Ragna had seen chickens do this twice in her life, and both times the weather that followed made the animals look wise and the people look foolish. On the evening of January 11th, the air warmed. Snow softened on the south-facing slopes and dripped from eaves. Men in town removed their heavy coats and said the worst was past. Children played outside without mittens. A freight driver coming east from Rapid City mentioned that the barometer at the telegraph office had dropped sharply, and the operator was nervous, but telegraph lines to the east were already down, and no one could confirm what was coming or when. Ragna stood in Beret's yard and looked at the western sky. The light was copper, a color that did not belong to January. The air tasted of nothing, no wood smoke, no manure, no pine, no grass. The wind had stopped completely and the silence had a weight to it, the way silence does in a room where someone has just stopped breathing. "Close the second door before you sleep," Ragna said, "and bring the cow's head into the chamber if she will fit." Beret asked why. Ragna pointed west with her crooked wrist. "Because tomorrow the air will remember what it is." She left for Niels Mohn's place, where she had been staying since the cold deepened. She walked slowly, leaning on her stick, and did not look back. The earthlock was finished in rough form. 9 feet of passage, 4.5 feet of arched ceiling, a crib roof of cottonwood poles, willow brush, hay, and sod, a plank inner door with a raised sill, a hanging quilt over the shack-side opening, a shallow exterior drain, a small vent shaft capped with tin. Inside the chamber, water crocks, a sack of potatoes, a sack of dried beans, spare bedding rolled tight, and a partition of stacked sod where the cow could shelter her head and shoulders if the lean-to failed. Beret tested the earthlock that evening the way Ragna had taught her. With evidence, not hope. She placed a water crock inside the shack, near the front door. She placed a second crock inside the earth chamber, against the clay wall. In the morning, the front crock had frozen at the lip, a skin of ice thick enough to tap with a fingernail. The chamber crock had not frozen at all. It was cold, near freezing, but liquid. The clay wall behind it was cool to the touch, but not cold. It felt like autumn, not winter. It felt like yesterday. She held a candle near the rear wall where the inner door met the shack frame. The flame stood straight, no lean, No flicker, no draft pulling heat through the seam. The earth lock had sealed the shack's worst wound. She damped the stove low that night and burned 1 armload of wood instead of 3. The front of the shack dropped to freezing by midnight, but the rear wall, the wall that now backed onto 9 feet of earth instead of open air, stayed above freezing. She could feel the difference with her palm. The front wall was a window into winter. The rear wall was a door into the day before. 1 cord and a quarter minus what she had burned through November and early January. She had perhaps 3/4 of a cord remaining. Clegg had said she needed 5 to 6 cords for a hard winter. If the earthlock continued to cut her burn rate by 2/3, 3/4 of a cord might last. The math was thin. The margin was a prayer. But it was math, not fantasy. And Beret had learned to live inside margins the way a seed lives inside soil. Tight, patient, waiting for what comes next. But Clegg's voice hung in the air like frost. Any fool can be warm when the wind rests. The wind had not yet spoken. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, the wind spoke. It did not arrive as weather. It arrived as sound. A low moan in the stovepipe that Beret had never heard before, a vibration that traveled down the iron and into the stove body and made the cracked plate hum like a struck bell. She was awake and dressed, because Ragna's warning had kept her from sleeping past dawn, and when the moan began, she was already standing near the stove with her coat on and her boots laced. The first sign was not snow. It was pressure. The shack walls flexed inward, both of them at once, as if a giant hand had pressed against the tar paper from outside. The front door rattled in its frame. The window board creaked. A fine powder of snow drove horizontally through the plank seams on the west wall and hung in the air like flour shaken from a cloth. Then the temperature fell. Beret could not see a thermometer because she did not own one, but she could feel the cold arrive the way you feel a blade laid against skin. First the pressure, then the edge. The stove was burning, the fire was open and drawing well, and the room was getting colder. She stuffed rags into the west wall seams. She pushed a blanket against the base of the front door. She checked the inner door to the earthlock passage and found it sealed, the raised sill holding, the hanging quilt on the shack side motionless. No draft, no leak. The passage was doing what Ragna said it would, sitting between the shack and the wind like a wall made of silence. But the front of the shack was losing. The stove burned and the cold won, and within the first hour the front wall had frosted from floor to ceiling, a white skin of ice crystals that grew inward like moss on a wet stone. The nail heads disappeared under frost. The window board turned white. Beret could see her breath, and her breath froze before it crossed the room. Outside, the world had ceased to exist. The window showed nothing, not white, not dark, but a gray emptiness that could have been 10 feet deep or 10 miles. The snow was not falling, it was flying. It moved horizontally, driven by a wind that had come south from the Arctic with nothing between it and the Dakota Plain but 600 miles of flat grass. The wind did not gust. It pressed. It leaned against everything that stood upright and tested whether it had the right to remain standing. Meta began bawling in the lean-to. The sound came through the west wall, muffled by wind but unmistakable. The low, panicked lowing of an animal that knows it is in danger and cannot understand why. The lean-to was 3 walls of scrap lumber and a tar paper roof. It had been adequate for a mild winter. It was not adequate for this. Beret faced a choice that Ragna had warned her about. Opening the inner passage door meant letting the cow's head and shoulders into the earth chamber partition, which meant moisture from the animal's breath, which meant frost on whatever surface was coldest, which meant wet bedding and possibly ice on the ceiling crib. But leaving the cow in the lean-to meant losing the cow, and losing the cow meant losing spring. She opened the inner door. The passage air hit her face like a hand cupped over her mouth. Still, cool, damp, but breathable. Not warm, not cold. The temperature of a root cellar, the temperature of yesterday, the temperature of earth that refused to keep up with the sky's tantrum. She led Meta by the halter through the shack and into the passage, bending the cow's neck low to clear the 4.5-foot ceiling. Meta resisted at the threshold, planting her hooves and leaning back. because animals know the difference between a room and a hole, and they do not trust holes. Beret pulled. Meta braced. Beret leaned her weight against the rope and felt her ribs light up with a pain that whitened her vision. The cow moved. She got Meta into the chamber partition and blocked the space with a board. The cow's breath fogged the chamber air immediately, and Beret could see moisture beginning to collect on the ceiling poles. Ragna's warning echoed. Animals make moisture, moisture makes frost. But the cow was alive, and the lean-to was already shuddering in the wind, and alive with moisture was better than frozen without it. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next decides whether her shelter holds heat or spends it all at once. Then someone pounded on the front door. Beret opened it, and the storm came in. Not metaphorically. The wind drove snow and cold through the opening in a horizontal sheet that crossed the room and struck the far wall and fell to the floor as a ridge of white powder. Standing in the doorway, half blind, his mittens stiff and his ears white above the collar of his coat, was Kittel Lundi. He had been sent by Niels Moen to check on Ragna at the Moen house, but the storm had erased the track rope between claims, and Kittel had walked by Dead Reckoning until Dead Reckoning failed. He had stumbled onto Beret's woodpile by accident and followed the shack wall to the door with his hands. Beret pulled him inside and shut the door. The room had lost in 10 seconds what the stove would take an hour to replace. She could feel the cold settling into the floor, into the walls, into the blanket she had pressed against the door frame. The temperature inside the front room was now barely distinguishable from the temperature outside, and the stove was burning as hard as it could burn. She looked at Kittel's ears. The skin was white and waxy, the color of tallow. The tips had no feeling. She had seen frostbite on Arvid's hands once, after a day of fence work in a February wind, and she knew that the treatment was warmth applied slowly, not heat applied fast. A frostbitten ear held against a hot stove would blister and die. A frostbitten ear held against a warm cloth would ache and live. She moved Kittel through the inner door into the passage. The passage was dark and smelled of clay and cow breath, and the damp wool of the quilt hanging on the shack side. But the air did not cut. It sat on Kittel's face like a damp cloth, and after 30 seconds in the front room where every breath had burned his throat, the passage air felt like mercy. She put him against the sod wall in the chamber, not beside the stove. She wrapped his ears in a cloth dampened with water from the crock. The crock that had not frozen, the crock that sat against the clay wall in the temperature of yesterday. Kittel whimpered when the feeling began to return, a sound like a puppy caught under a fence, and Beret held the cloth in place and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the warmth was not already saying. The stove smoke began to hesitate. She noticed it as a change in the air, a thickening, a sourness that had not been there before. The smoke that should have risen through the pipe was leaning, pooling, spreading sideways through the cracked plate. Wind pressure outside had shifted, and the draft that pulled smoke upward was now fighting a column of air being forced down the pipe from above. The shack was filling with smoke. Beret remembered Ragna's vent lesson. The vent shaft in the earth chamber angled upward through the bank, and because it exited on the lee side of the hill, away from the wind, it was not being pressured the way the stovepipe was. She cracked the vent cover inside the chamber, just enough to let air move. The passage created a gentle draw. Air entered through the vent, crossed the chamber, moved through the passage, and exited through the shack's front wall seams. The smoke line in the stovepipe lifted. The cracked plate stopped leaking. Kittel coughed twice, hard, and then breathed. The first hour passed. The second hour pressed down harder. Outside, the storm was killing. Not everywhere and not everyone, but in the specific targeted way that plains blizzards kill, by catching people between places. Between the house and the barn, between the school and the home, between one claim and the next. The children's blizzard, as it would be named in the months and years that followed, was not the coldest storm or the deepest snow. It was the fastest. It arrived after a warm spell that had emptied the houses, and it closed the world so quickly that a man who stepped outside to check his horse could lose the house behind him before he reached the fence. Niels Moen's sod house held better than any frame shack in the settlement because sod was what Beret's earthlock was, a thick wall of earth that held yesterday. But Niels had an attached shed with a timber roof, and the wind found the joint between shed and house and began to work it the way a man works a loose tooth. The shed roof lifted at one corner. Snow drove under the gap. Niels burned wood hard and fast because every trip to the shed to check livestock cost heat through the open door, and every open door was a payment the stove could not match. Clegg's larger cabin had wood. He had 5 cords stacked and tarped, more than enough for any winter, and his stove was sound and his walls were tight. But he too had livestock, and livestock required tending, and tending required opening the door, and opening the door required burning more wood to replace what the opening lost. His system worked. It was expensive, but it worked. That was the difference between Clegg's approach and Beret's. His approach was correct and costly. Hers was untested and cheap. The storm was deciding which mattered more. Vale's freight barn had fuel. Sail coal he kept for customers who paid in advance. He burned through it to keep his horses alive, because horses were his livelihood, and a dead horse cost more than coal. But the barn had no protected living chamber, no buffer, no earth wall between the interior and the wind. It was a large wooden box with a stove in it, and the stove was losing the argument the way every stove was losing the argument that night, by fighting the wind with fire and finding that fire was not enough. Past midnight, someone else nearly died. A boy named Ed Tolliver, 12 years old from the claim east of Clegg's, had been sent to the outhouse when the storm hit and could not find his way back. His father searched for 10 minutes, found nothing, and retreated inside because searching longer meant 2 dead instead of 1. The boy had crawled downwind until he hit a haystack and pressed himself into the lee side, curling tight with his hands under his arms and his face against the frozen hay. Clegg and Niels found him after midnight, following a faint sound that could have been wind or could have been a boy trying to call for help with lungs that had forgotten how to fill. He was alive. His fingers were white, his feet were senseless in his boots. His lips were blue. They carried him to Clegg's cabin, but the cabin was losing heat through every chore trip, and the boy could not warm. He shook and stopped shaking and shook again, and the stopping was worse than the shaking because stopping meant the body was quitting. Ragna was at Niels's house. She had been sheltering there since the storm hit, unable to travel. But Niels made the crossing to Clegg's in the brief pause between gusts, holding a rope tied to his porch post, and Ragna sent back a message. Bring the boy to Beret's earth chamber. It has still air and stored bedding. It holds the temperature of a root cellar. It will not warm him fast, but it will warm him steady, and steady is what a frozen boy needs. The skeptics looked at each other. Clegg, who had called it a hole tied to a bad cabin. Niels, who had warned about clay and smoke and collapse. They were being told to carry a dying child into the structure they had mocked and trust it with a life they could not save by other means. They carried the boy across the snow. Beret opened the inner door only long enough to admit them. Clegg came through first, crouching, holding the boy's shoulders. Niels came second with the legs. They laid him on the bedding in the chamber, against the sod wall, away from the stove and away from the cow. The chamber smelled of clay, cow breath, damp wool, and smoke. It was not pleasant. It was not warm in any way a stove-heated room was warm, but the air did not cut. The air sat still and held a temperature that felt like a different season, and the boy's shaking slowed from violent to steady to a tremor that meant the body was working again instead of giving up. They pulled his boots off. The skin came with the leather in one place, a patch of dead white on his right heel, but the toes moved. The toes moved because the chamber air had not frozen them further, and the clay wall behind the bedding was giving back the warmth of the day before, slowly, the way earth gives back everything, without urgency, without waste, without asking for payment. The butter beret kept in the chamber softened enough to cut with a knife. The water crocks were liquid. The potatoes were hard but not frozen stone. The frost that covered every surface in the front room had not entered the chamber. The passage stood between the storm and the chamber like a throat made of earth, swallowing the wind's intention and giving back silence. Then the roof cracked. Not the chamber roof. The passage roof, at the second crib set, 6 feet in. A drift had built against the bank above the tunnel, and the weight of snow on wet sod on brush on poles was more than the cottonwood had been asked to carry. The sound was sharp. Not a crash, but a snap, like a bone breaking inside a body, muffled by the layers above it. Clay dust fell into the lamp flame, and the light guttered. Beret, Clegg, Nils, and Kittle froze. The cow made a sound low in her throat. The boy on the bedding did not move. Beret listened. She could hear the clay above the cracked pole shifting, the soft sound of particles rearranging, each grain a small decision about whether to hold or fall. She remembered Ragna's words from the first day. Not the center, the shoulder. A roof fails where the weight concentrates, and weight concentrates where the arch is weakest. She crawled into the passage with the lamp. The cracked pole was the second crib crosspiece, split along the grain where a knot had weakened it. The split was not complete. The pole still held, but it held the way a man holds a load he's about to drop, with visible strain and diminishing grip. Above it, the sod cap sagged inward, and a thin line of snow melt dripped through the brush layer and fell onto the passage floor. Beret grabbed one of Niels's crooked poles, the ones he had left without admitting, and jammed it under the failing rib, angling it so the fresh pole took the weight that the cracked one was releasing. The fit was wrong. The pole was too long by 3 inches and sat at an angle that transferred force sideways instead of downward. "Hold this," she said. Clegg looked at her. He was a man who had built things and fixed things and survived things for 40 years, and he was crouching in a clay tunnel he had dismissed as a grave, holding a dying boy's life in one hand and his pride in the other. He could help or he could refuse, and refusing meant the roof might fail and the passage might close, and they would all be buried in the thing he had said would bury her. Clegg braced the pole with his shoulder. Beret split a piece of firewood into a wedge with the axe, and drove it between the new pole and the sagging ceiling, tightening the fit until the pole stood straight and the weight transferred cleanly from cracked timber to sound timber. The sod cap stopped sagging. The drip slowed. The clay above settled with a sound like a long exhale, the sound of earth deciding to hold. The storm blew for 11 more hours. Beret burned twigs and chips and small pieces of scrub oak, feeding the stove the way a nurse feeds a patient, how in measured portions, never enough to satisfy, always enough to sustain. The front room stayed barely livable. The passage stayed still. The chamber stayed at the temperature of yesterday, which was warmer than today and infinitely warmer than tonight. The boy's color returned before dawn. Kittle's ears were red and swollen, but alive. Meta had stopped bawling and stood in her partition with her head low, breathing the slow breath of an animal that has decided it will survive this. Clegg sat against the passage wall with his eyes closed, not sleeping, but no longer watching, which for a man like Clegg was the closest thing to trust. Sometime before sunrise, the wind stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way a voice stops mid-sentence, a sudden absence that left the ears ringing. The silence was so complete that Beret could hear the stove ticking as it cooled, and the cow shifting her weight, and Kittle breathing through his swollen nose, and the slow drip of melt from the repaired roof. She opened the front door. The world outside was carved into shapes that did not make sense, drifts 6 feet high beside patches of bare ground scoured to frozen mud. The snow was so fine it looked like sand. The sky was clear and yellow at the horizon, the color of a bruise healing. Beret had burned less than a quarter of the wood that Clegg had predicted she would need for a night like this. The earthlock had held. The passage had stood. The chamber had kept its temperature while the world outside tried to kill everything that breathed. But the victory was not clean. Kittle would lose part of one ear, the tip where the white had gone deepest. The boy's heel would scar. Meta was trembling in a way that might mean cold, or might mean something a cow could not explain. Beret's ribs had worsened, and she could feel a catch in her breath when she inhaled deeply, a hitch that meant something had shifted inside the wrapping. The passage roof was compromised, held together by a crooked pole and a split wedge, and the decision of Clay to forgive what had been asked of it. They had survived. But survival, Beret was learning, was not a single night. It was the morning after, and the morning after that, and every morning until the world decided to let you live without fighting for it. The morning after the storm, the world looked like a quarrel between wind and earth that neither had won. Drifts stood 6 feet high against the south side of buildings, while the north side lay scoured to bare, frozen mud. Fence posts had disappeared. Roof edges trailed curtains of packed snow. The sky was scrubbed clean and empty, a blue so hard it looked like metal. Clegg left the earth chamber before dawn. He did not speak to Beret. He walked into the passage, crouching under the repaired ceiling, and went through the shack and out the front door without looking back. Beret did not take offense. Clegg was a man who processed information the way clay processed temperature, slowly, layer by layer, without announcing each stage. Niels carried the Tolliver boy to his own house, where the boy's father was waiting with a face that could not decide between gratitude and shame. Kittel stayed. His ears were swollen, and the right one was beginning to blacken at the tip, and Beret kept warm, damp cloths on them through the morning while the boy slept against the sod wall with Meta's breath fogging above his head. The first visitor arrived before noon. It was Clegg. He came back. He walked past the shack without stopping and went directly to the woodpile. Beret watched him through the window board. He circled the pile, counting. He counted twice. Then he stood still for a long time, looking at the pile with the expression of a man whose arithmetic has produced an answer he does not want to accept. He entered the shack. He looked at the stove, which was burning low on chips and small scrub. He looked at the frost on the front wall, which was already beginning to recede as the day warmed. Then he walked to the inner door and entered the passage. He moved through it slowly this time, running his hand along the arched ceiling, touching each crib pole, pressing his thumb into the clay above the repaired section. He reached the chamber and stood as straight as the 4.5-foot ceiling allowed, which was not very straight, and looked at the water crocks, the potatoes, the bedding where the Tolliver boy had lain, the sod partition where Meta stood chewing cud. "How much wood did you burn last night?" Clegg said. Beret told him. Less than a quarter of what he had predicted for a night that bad. Clegg was quiet. He touched the clay wall the way he had touched the frost on the north wall in October, pressing his palm flat and holding it there. The clay was cool, not cold, the kind of temperature that belongs to a pantry in autumn, not a shelter in January. "I told you to buy wood," Clegg said. "I could not," Beret said. Clegg pulled his hand from the wall. He looked at the ceiling, the poles, the brush, the sod cap above. He looked at the drainage trench, still dry despite the storm. He looked at the vent shaft, which had saved them all from smoke the night before. "Then you bought time," he said. He said it the way he said everything, flat, factual, stripped of sentiment. But the words were a door opening, and both of them knew it. Clegg had measured Beret's failure in chords and found it inadequate, and now he was measuring her success in the same units and finding that his formula had a variable he had never accounted for. The variable was the earth itself. The variable was the wall that kept yesterday. He left again. But this time, when he passed the woodpile, he stopped and restacked 3 pieces that had tumbled in the wind, setting them bark side up the way a man stacks wood he expects someone to use. Niels Moen came the next day. He brought his wife, Sina, and his 2 children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 4. The children had never been inside a dugout or a tunnel or anything that went into the earth, and the passage frightened the girl until Meta stuck her head around the partition and blew warm air into the child's face. Niels did not apologize for his earlier doubt. He did not mention the 2 poles he had left anonymously against Beret's woodpile. What he did was ask questions, and asking questions was Niels Moen's version of conversion. He asked about the arch. Beret showed him, running her hand along the curve the way Ragna had shown her, explaining how the weight carried down through the shoulders and into the walls and the walls into the floor. She used the language Ragna had taught her. Clay does not hang. Clay leans. Everything carries everything. He asked about the drainage. Beret walked him to the trench outside and showed him the slope. the 1 inch per 6 feet that gravity needed to move water without making the footing treacherous. The trench was dry. Every other low spot in the settlement was pooled with melt. He asked about the smoke. Beret showed him the vent shaft, the angle, the tin cap. She lit a candle in the chamber, and they watched the flame lean gently toward the vent, confirming that air moved through the passage without being forced. "My shed roof is torn," Niels said. "The wind took a corner." This was not a request. It was the closest Niels could come to asking for help without the word help leaving his mouth. Beret said she would look at it. Niels nodded once and left with his family. Sina lingered at the passage entrance and touched the clay wall with one finger, the way you touch something you are not sure is real. Over the next week, the settlement came to Beret's shack in stages. First the men who wanted to see the chamber, entering cautiously, touching the walls, testing the ceiling with their knuckles. Then the women who came to check on Kittle and stayed to ask about the water crocks that had not frozen. Then the children who discovered that the passage made echoes and the clay walls could be drawn on with sticks. Each visitor left with information. Beret did not hoard it. She drew the design in ash on the floor of the shack, the slope, the drain, the arch, the crib, the sod cap, the vent, the second door. She drew it the way Ragna had taught her to build it, as a system, not a trick. Each piece depended on every other piece, and leaving one out was like leaving a step out of a recipe. The measurable comparisons spread through the settlement like weather, and like weather they were impossible to argue with. Beret had burned roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the wood that Clegg's formula predicted for a storm of that severity. Niels had used nearly a week's supply of fuel in 2 days because every livestock trip opened the door and every open door spent heat. Vale's freight barn had burned through sail coal and still lost a horse to exposure, a loss worth more than Beret's entire note. Clegg's cabin had survived on adequate wood, but adequate wood cost adequate money, and adequate money was precisely what most settlers did not have. The innovation was not that Beret had invented something new. Dugouts and sod houses and root cellars had sheltered people on the plains for decades. The innovation was that she had connected a failing shack to the earth behind it using nothing but a pick, salvaged poles, and knowledge borrowed from a woman who had spent 50 years listening to clay. She had not made heat from nothing. She had stopped the cabin from giving heat away. The difference was the difference between pouring water into a cracked bucket and mending the crack. But not everyone was willing to pour water into a bucket they had spent months calling a grave. Orson Vale did not visit. He did not inspect. He did not ask questions. What he did was stand at the store and reframe Beret's survival as recklessness. "She put a boy in a dirt hole," Vale said. "She put an animal in a dirt hole. She invited men into a structure that cracked during the storm. If the roof had come down, we would be digging 4 people out of the bank instead of praising her." The argument was not entirely wrong, which made it more dangerous than a lie. The roof had cracked. The passage had required emergency repair. The chamber had never been tested before the storm, and testing a shelter with human lives inside it was not the same as testing a theory on paper. Vale's objection had the shape of reason, and reason was harder to fight than malice. "The county should know what kind of structures people are building," Vale continued, "before someone dies in one." He did not say he wanted Beret's claim. He did not need to. Everyone in the store knew what Vale wanted, the same way everyone knew what a buzzard wanted when it circled. The question was whether the settlement would hand him the carcass or make him wait. Ragna came back to Beret's shack 3 days after the storm, walking slowly, leaning on her willow stick more than before. She had caught the cold that lives in the space between exertion and rest, the cold that finds you after the crisis passes and your body remembers it has been spending more than it earned. She and Beret worked together that week on Niels Moen's shed. The torn roof corner needed reframing, and Ragna advised on how to bank the north side of the shed with packed earth and sod so that the joint between shed and house would not flex in wind. They used the same principle. Put earth between the living space and the weather, and let the earth hold yesterday while the weather does what it wants with today. They disagreed on the second day. Beret wanted to extend the banking around the east wall of Niels's shed, creating a continuous earth barrier on 3 sides. Ragna said no. 2 sides were enough. The east wall needed air circulation in summer to keep the sod from rotting, and a woman who sealed every surface against winter was a woman who would fight mold in July. "You think like January," Ragna said. "January is not the only month." "January is the month that kills," Beret said. "July is the month that rots what January built. A shelter that cannot breathe in summer is a shelter you will rebuild every fall." 2 sides, Beret. "Leave the east wall open," Beret argued. She had nearly died because her shack could not hold heat, and the instinct to seal, to close, to bank every surface against wind was so strong it felt like sense. But Ragna had built structures that lasted decades, not months, and she understood something Beret was still learning. Survival and durability were not the same problem. A shelter that kept you alive through January and fell apart by August was not a shelter. It was a temporary miracle, and temporary miracles were the most expensive kind. Beret left the east wall open. It cost her nothing but pride, and pride was a currency she could not spend at the store. Niels watched them work and asked questions he could have answered himself, because watching Beret apply Ragna's teaching was different from being told about it. When Beret packed the earth against the shed wall, she packed it in layers: loose soil, then tamped soil, then sod grass side down, and each layer served a purpose she could name. When she cut the sod, she angled the blade so the grass roots held the underside together, and when she placed the slabs, she overlapped them the way shingles overlap, so water ran across the surface instead of soaking through. Ragna watched Beret teach Niels and said nothing. This was the final lesson, and it was not about clay or sod or drainage. It was about the moment when the student becomes the one who explains, and the teacher becomes the one who watches, and the knowledge passes from hand to hand without losing its shape. But Ragna was not well. She had coughed since the storm, a dry scrape at first, then deeper, then wet. She dismissed it the way old women dismiss ailments, with a wave of the hand and a change of subject. But Beret heard the cough shorten Ragna's sentences and saw the way she paused on the walk between Niels's house and the shack, leaning on the stick with both hands, her breath catching halfway through an inhale. Her skin had gone the color of ash, and when she gripped the walking stick, her knuckles showed white against hands that had always been ruddy and brown. Beret brought her into the earth chamber because the chamber air was still and warm enough to ease breathing, and because Ragna had built the chamber and deserved to rest inside the thing she had made possible. She heated broth on the stove and carried it through the passage, crouching under the arched ceiling that Ragna's teaching had shaped. On the 4th day after the storm, Beret found Ragna sitting on the passage floor inside the earth lock, her back against the clay wall, a cup of broth untouched beside her. Ragna's face was gray. Her fingers, resting on her black wool shawl, left marks of flour she had been too tired to brush off. Her breathing sounded like cloth tearing slowly, one fiber at a time. "You should rest," Beret said. "I am resting," Ragna said. "This is what resting looks like when you're 58 and the ground is deciding whether to keep you or take you." Beret sat beside her. The chamber was quiet. Meta breathed in the partition. The vent shaft whispered. The clay wall held its temperature, which was the temperature of the day before the storm, which was the temperature of a world where Ragna had not yet gotten sick. "Do not let men make you keeper of every fool's shovel," Ragna said. Beret did not understand. "You will teach," Ragna said. "They will come. Some will listen. Some will take what you say and do half of it and blame you when the half fails. Do not carry that. Teach clearly. Show the drainage. Show the arch. Show the vent. But when a man digs into a wet bank because he's too proud to dig a trench first, that is his grave, not yours." She closed her eyes. Her breathing steadied into something that sounded less like tearing and more like sleeping, and Beret sat beside her in the earth-scented dark and said nothing, because the silence felt like the kind of space that should not be filled. Ragna Lunde died on a Tuesday in late January in Niels Mohn's sod house, with Sina holding one hand and Kittle holding the other. Pneumonia had taken root in lungs that had spent too many storms walking between houses, and too many nights sleeping in rooms that were warm enough for healthy people and not warm enough for sick ones. She died the way she had lived, without complaint, without spectacle, without asking anyone to make it easier. Beret learned of the death from Kittle, who walked to her shack with red eyes and a voice that kept breaking on consonants. She did not cry. She went to the passage and placed her hand on the arched ceiling, feeling the curve that Ragna had taught her to cut, the shape that carried weight downward instead of hanging it in the air. The clay was cool and solid under her palm. It held. She thought about Ragna's hands, the crooked left wrist, the way she tested clay by spitting on it, the way she poured water on a flat floor and watched it pool and said, "Water is patient." The way she had looked at Beret's failed square cut and asked not what happened, but what did you learn? The earth holds yesterday. Ragna had taught Beret that principle, and now the principle would have to hold Ragna's teaching the same way, layer by layer, carried forward into days the teacher would not see. They buried Ragna on the hillside above the spring seep. Beret cut a square of roof sod from beside the earthlock entrance and placed it on the grave, grass side down, the way Ragna had taught her to roof against weather. It was not a monument. It was a method, applied one final time by hands that had learned it from the hands now beneath the ground. The thaw came in March, and it came wrong. A warm front pushed north from Kansas and met the frozen ground like hot water poured on glass. Rain fell on snow. Snow became water. Water ran downhill, and downhill was where the earthlocks and banked entries and sod vestibules sat, because downhill was where the banks were, and the banks were where the shelter was. Beret's earthlock handled the thaw because Ragna had forced her to build the drainage trench first. Water ran across the passage floor and out the trench mouth and down the slope without pooling, without seeping, without undermining the walls. The ceiling dripped at one spot where the sod cap had thinned, and Beret repacked it with fresh sod and tamped earth, spending an afternoon on maintenance that prevented a week of damage. But the earthlock was not the only one now. In the weeks after the blizzard, 3 families had begun building their own versions. 2 had followed Beret's instructions carefully. Drainage first, arched walls, cribbed ceiling, vent shaft, sod cap. 1 had not. The one that had not belonged to a man named Mercer, a homesteader east of Vale's freight barn, who had heard about the earthlock and decided he could do it faster and cheaper without the parts that seemed like fuss. He dug straight into a wet bank, cut square walls, roofed with green poles and thin sod, and skipped the drainage trench, because digging a trench was not the same as digging a shelter, and he could not see the point of digging something that was not the thing he wanted. Vale had encouraged him, not openly, not with advice he could be blamed for, but with the specific absence of warning that a man like Vale could deploy like a weapon. When Mercer mentioned skipping the trench, Vale said nothing. When Mercer bragged about finishing in 3 days instead of 8, Vale nodded. Vale understood that a failure built in Beret's name was worth more than any argument he could make with words. The March thaw found Mercer's tunnel like a hand finding a pocket. Water ran down the bank, soaked through the thin sod cap, saturated the green poles, and turned the square clay walls into mud. The entrance slumped first, a slow collapse that sounded like a boot pulling out of thick muck. Then the roof sagged. Then the far wall bulged inward, pushing Mercer's stored feed and bedding into a pile against the opposite wall. Mercer was not inside. His milk cow was. The cow bawled. Mercer tried to clear the entrance, but the slumped clay was heavy with water, and every shovelful he removed was replaced by more sliding down from above. The cow was trapped behind a wall of wet earth that was still moving, still settling, still deciding how much of the tunnel it wanted to reclaim. The sound carried. It always did in the settlement, across frozen ground that transmitted vibration like a telegraph wire. Beret heard it from her shack, a rhythmic shouting punctuated by the deep bellowing of a trapped animal, and she knew before she arrived what had happened and why. She walked to Mercer's claim and found him standing in front of the collapsed entrance, with a shovel in his hands and mud to his knees. Two neighbors were with him, digging without coordination, pulling clay from the entrance and piling it where it slid back in. Beret assessed the bank the way Ragna had taught her. She looked at the water, where it was coming from, where it was pooling, where it was finding the path of least resistance into the collapsed face. She looked at the soil, wet clay mixed with sand, the kind of mix that held nothing when saturated. She looked at the roofline, which was sagging along its entire length because the green poles had flexed instead of holding, and the thin sod cap had turned to mud. She looked at the drainage. There was no drainage. And she understood the full architecture of the failure and the time it took to walk from the road to the bank. Every mistake Ragna had warned against was present. Square cuts, wet bank, no trench, green timber, thin sod. The tunnel was a catalog of the shortcuts that turned shelter into burial, and Beret could read each one like a sentence in a language Ragna had taught her. She did not lecture, she organized. "Stop digging at the face," she told the neighbors. "You are pulling weight off the bottom, and the top is following it down. The face will keep collapsing as long as water feeds it from above." She sent Kittle, who had arrived behind her, his swollen ear wrapped in cloth, to find brush mats from the mow-in place. Brush mats laid over the bank surface would slow the water's entry while they worked below. She told Clegg, who had come from his cabin at the sound, to cut willow from the draw and bring it in bundles for temporary shoring. She told Niels to start a relief trench, not at the tunnel mouth but 10 feet to the side and 3 feet lower, angling downhill so that water feeding the collapse would have somewhere else to go before it reached the face. "The water is the problem," Beret said, "not the clay. The clay fell because the water told it to. Give the water a different path and the clay will stop moving." Niels dug. His shovel cut through the saturated ground in long, wet strokes, and within 20 minutes the relief trench began to draw a dark line of water away from the collapsed bank. The flow was visible. A steady stream diverted from the tunnel face into the new channel, and as the flow shifted, the slumping at the tunnel mouth slowed. Clegg returned with willow bundles. Beret jammed them into the collapsed opening as bracing, not to rebuild the tunnel, but to hold the remaining clay in place while they dug a narrow rescue channel to reach the cow. She worked on her hands and knees, pulling wet clay by handfuls because a shovel in the confined space risked destabilizing what remained of the walls. "The water is the problem," Beret said, "not the clay. The clay fell because the water told it to. Give the water a different path and the clay will stop moving." Niels dug. Clegg cut. Kittle ran. Mercer stood and watched a woman half his size take command of a disaster that bore his name, and the expression on his face was the specific blend of shame and relief that belongs to a man who has just discovered that the person he did not listen to was the person he should have listened to first. Vale arrived. He did not offer to dig. He stood at the edge of the work and watched with an expression that could have been concern or satisfaction or both. And when Beret's relief trench began to draw water away from the collapsed face and the clay stopped sliding, Vale said, loud enough for the group to hear, "This is what happens when people build without knowing what they're doing." He meant Beret. He wanted the failure hung around her neck, the way a man hangs a sign on a broken fence. Beret straightened from the trench. She was muddy to the elbows, her ribs aching, her hands raw from clay. She looked at Vale and said, "This is what happens when people build without drainage. I taught drainage first. Ask him what he skipped." She turned back to the work. Vale's mouth opened and closed. Mercer looked at the ground. The neighbors kept digging. They cleared the entrance in 2 hours. The cow came out muddy, shaking, but alive. Mercer's tunnel was ruined. The walls had lost their shape, and the roof would need to be pulled down and rebuilt from scratch. But the cow was worth more than the tunnel, and the lesson was worth more than the cow. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, why the ditch comes before the roof, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the weather makes the lesson expensive. Beret helped Mercer rebuild. She made him dig the drainage trench first, even though the ground was soft and the work was miserable, and Mercer wanted to start on the walls because walls felt like progress, and trenches felt like delay. She made him cut an arch instead of a square. She made him use thicker poles and dry sod, and she made him wait 3 days for the sod to settle before packing earth on top. "You skipped the ditch," Beret told him. "The ditch is the foundation. Everything else is built on the assumption that water has somewhere to go. Without the ditch, you're building on a lie." Mercer listened. He did not enjoy listening, and his face said so, but his cow was alive because of the woman talking, and his tunnel was rubble because of the man who had told him the ditch was not important. Word spread, not as gossip this time, but as instruction. Beret helped 2 more families plan their own windlocks, smaller than hers, adapted to their specific banks and soil conditions. She insisted on the same sequence every time: drainage first, arch second, crib third, sod cap fourth, vent fifth. The men wanted to start with the vent because the vent was the clever part, the part that sounded like engineering. Beret made them start with the trench because the trench was the boring part, the part that saved lives. An older bachelor named Peter Assen came to ask about digging under cottonwood roots. Beret told him not to. Roots channeled water and weakened clay, and a tunnel dug under a cottonwood was a tunnel dug under a system of pipes that would fill with meltwater every spring. Peter argued. Beret took him to the bank behind her shack and showed him where a single root the thickness of her wrist had cracked the clay above the drainage trench. One root, one crack, one season of freeze and thaw, and the crack would become a channel, and the channel would become a failure. "Dig where the bank is clean," Beret said. "Roots are neighbors you did not invite. They will not leave when you ask." Peter dug where the bank was clean. By mid-March, Beret had advised on 5 earth-sheltered structures of various kinds. 3 were banked entries, short passages connecting existing shacks to the earth behind them, like Beret's original design. 1 was a sod vestibule, an above-ground windbreak packed with earth on 3 sides, for a family whose bank was too sandy for tunneling. 1 was a root chamber tied to a kitchen wall for a widow who wanted to keep food from freezing without walking to an outbuilding. Each one was different. Each one followed the same principles. Drain first, arch the load, vent the air, seal the cap. The principles were Ragna's. The hands were Beret's. The knowledge was moving from person to person the way warmth moved through earth, slowly, without waste, without asking for payment. But Vale was still there. He had not converted. He had not apologized. He had not come to Beret's shack to ask about slope or drainage or arch shape. What he had done was shift his attack from mockery to legitimacy. He talked about county inspections. He talked about building standards. He talked about the danger of untrained women giving structural advice to men who should know better. He still held Beret's note. Payment was due before spring filing. The note was $9.70 plus interest, and Beret had spent the winter surviving instead of earning, and $12.40 minus a winter's worth of lamp wick and flour and coffee and stove repairs left her with less than the note demanded. Vale had not pressed the note yet. He was waiting. A man like Vale understood that timing was a weapon, and the best time to call a debt was the moment when paying it was possible, but painful. Possible enough that the debtor could not claim hardship, painful enough that it broke something they needed. Spring filing was 6 weeks away. If Beret could not pay the note, Vale could force a sale. If Vale forced a sale, the claim went to auction, and the only man with cash at auction would be the man who had arranged the auction. The spring seep and the sheltered bank that made Beret's claim worth fighting for were the same features that made it worth stealing, and Vale had been patient enough to let winter do the work of persuasion while he stood by the store stove with his ledger under his arm. Beret counted what she had. The $12.40 she had started with had shrunk through winter, lamp wick, flour, coffee, salt, a stove collar patch that cost 75 cents because the storekeeper charged extra for not having credit. She had $8.15. The note was $9.70 plus interest that had been growing since September. She was short by at least $2, and $2 in a settlement where a day's labor paid 50 cents was 4 days of work she did not have time to do. She could sell the cow. Meta was worth $8 to an honest buyer, enough to clear the note and leave a margin. But selling Met meant losing milk, losing barter. losing the animal that had breathed warmth into the earth chamber on the worst night of the year. Selling the cow was what Clegg had told her to do in October, and doing it now felt like proving him right on a delay, which was worse than proving him right immediately because it meant she had suffered the whole winter for nothing. She could ask for help. Niels owed her nothing in writing, but owed her something in the mathematics of conscience. Clegg had braced a pole in her passage while clay dust fell around them. Kittle was alive because of the earth lock. The settlement owed her a debt that had no ledger page and no interest rate and no due date, and debts like that were the hardest to collect because they required the debtor to admit they existed. The storm had tested the earth lock. The thaw had tested the drainage. Vale was testing something harder, whether a woman who could survive winter could survive the men who owned the paper that winter was printed on. Beret lay in the earth chamber that night, listening to Meta breathe and the vent shaft whisper and the clay wall hold its silence. She thought about Ragna's last words. Do not let men make you keeper of every fool's shovel. She thought about Clegg's conversion. Then you bought time. She thought about Niels's 2 anonymous poles and Kittle's swollen ear and the Tolliver boy's heel that would scar for life. She had survived the storm. She had survived the thaw. She had taught 5 families to shelter against weather that would have killed them. She had organized a rescue that saved a cow and a man's pride and silenced Orson Vale in front of witnesses. And Orson Vale still held her note, and the note did not care about any of it. Vale called in the note on a Wednesday in early March, 2 weeks before spring filing. He sent the boy again, the same Tolliver child who had counted Beret's woodpile in November, with a paper that said payment was due in 7 days, or the claim would be listed for forced sale. The paper was written in ink so neat it looked like printing, because Vale understood that the appearance of order was itself a kind of authority, and a woman staring at clean penmanship might mistake it for law. Beret read the paper at her table. 7 days. $9.70 plus interest that had grown since September, bringing the total to $10.85. She had $8.15. The gap was $2.70, which in the mathematics of frontier settlement was the width of the distance between keeping everything she had fought for and losing it to a man who had spent the winter by the store stove waiting for weather to do his work. She did not panic. She did not sell the cow. She sat at the table and looked at the paper and thought about what she had built and who had helped build it, not in the currency of sentiment, but in the currency of obligation. The kind of debt that has no paper and no interest rate, but that honest people feel in the space between their ribs. The next morning, Niels Moen appeared at her door with $2 in coin. He did not explain. He set the money on the table and said, "For the poles." Beret understood. The 2 crooked cottonwood poles he had left against her woodpile in November, the ones he had never admitted delivering, the ones that now braced the repaired section of her passage ceiling. He was paying himself back by paying her forward, transforming an anonymous gift into a transaction so that neither of them would have to call it charity. Clegg came next. He brought no cash. He brought a stoveplate, iron, the right size, uncracked. He had carried it from a claim 10 miles south where a family had abandoned their filing and left their stove to rust. He had walked 20 miles round trip for a piece of iron, and when Beret asked what she owed him, he said, "You owe me a warm shack that does not fill with smoke when I come to inspect your fool tunnel." The stoveplate was worth more than cash. It meant her stove would burn clean, which meant less wood wasted to smoke, which meant the earth lock's efficiency compounded. A sealed stove and an earth-buffered wall together reduced fuel consumption to a fraction of what Clegg's original formula demanded, and that fraction was the margin between dependence and independence, between a woman who needed credit and a woman who did not. Kittle brought 75 cents from Ragna's small savings, which Sina Moen had been keeping. He set it on the table beside Niels's $2 and Beret's $8.15. The total was $10.90. 5 cents more than the note. Others came, not with money, most had none, but with labor and goods that could be exchanged for the few things money still needed to buy. A woman named Barbara Haugen brought 3 dozen eggs worth 30 cents at the store. Pedersen brought a half-day of fence labor. The Tolliver family, the same family whose boy had nearly frozen against the haystack, brought a sack of cornmeal and an apology that took the form of the father standing in Beret's yard with his hat in his hands, unable to say what he meant until Beret said, "Your boy is alive. That is enough." The father nodded and set the cornmeal on the step and walked away, and the walking was faster than the coming had been because carrying guilt uphill is slower than setting it down. Mercer came last. He brought no money and no goods. He brought the information that Vale had told him skipping the drainage trench would save time, and that Vale had nodded when Mercer bragged about finishing in 3 days. It was not proof of anything a court would recognize, but it was proof of what the settlement already knew, that Vale's concern for county order was a mask worn over appetite, and the appetite was for land, not safety. Beret did not use the information. She filed it the way she filed everything Vale did, in the part of her mind that tracked threats the way a farmer tracks weather, watching patterns without expecting to control them. What mattered was the note. What mattered was the money. What mattered was $10.90, sitting on her table in a cloth purse made from the same flour sack she had drawn, the earthlock design on 3 months earlier. Beret walked to the store on a Tuesday morning with $10.90 in a cloth purse. She asked the storekeeper to witness. She placed the money on the counter and asked for Orson Vale. Vale came from the back of the store where he had been sorting freight manifests. He looked at the money. He looked at Beret. He looked at the storekeeper who was watching with the expression of a man who has been given a front row seat to something he will be telling for years. "The note is $10.85, Beret said. "There is $10.90. I will take the 5 cents in change." Vale counted the money. He counted it twice, the way Clegg had counted the woodpile. Slowly, looking for a number that was not there. The number was there. The money was real. The note was paid. He wrote "paid" on the paper and signed it and pushed it across the counter. He did not congratulate her. He did not acknowledge the winter, the storm, the earthlock, the boy, the cow, the rescue, the 5 families she had taught, or the settlement that had pooled its scraps to keep one woman on land that a man with a ledger had tried to take. "Spring filing is in 2 weeks, Vale said. "I expect you will be here." "I expect I will," Beret said. She took the 5 cents and left. The storekeeper told the story by evening. By the end of the week it had reached claims 5 miles out, carried not by gossip, but by the specific admiration that frontier people reserved for someone who had beaten the system that was supposed to beat them. Vale's freight shed took wind damage in a late March storm, the kind of sharp blow that comes after the worst has passed and catches people who have already relaxed. The north wall, which Vale had never banked because banking was what Beret did, and Vale would not do what Beret did, flexed inward under a gust that popped 3 boards loose and let snow drive across his stored freight. A barrel of flour took moisture. A crate of hardware shifted and spilled nails across the dirt floor. The damage was not catastrophic in any single piece, but the sum of it, warped boards, wet flour, scattered stock, a wall that now whistled in any wind above 10 miles, was expensive, and expense was a language Vale understood better than weather. He spent 2 days nailing patches over the popped boards. The patches held against calm air and failed against the next gust, because a patch on a wall that flexes is a bandage on a wound that will not close. What the wall needed was not more nails. What the wall needed was something behind it that did not move when the wind pushed, something heavy and patient and indifferent to air pressure. What the wall needed was earth. 3 boards of freight-grade lumber cost more than a half day of digging a drainage trench and packing earth against the base. And Vale was a man who calculated cost the way a clock calculates time, continuously, automatically, without sentiment. The calculation had been running since January, since the night of the blizzard, since he sat in his barn burning sail coal while Beret sat in a clay chamber burning twigs. He had dismissed the calculation every time it produced the same answer, because the answer required him to do what Beret did, and doing what Beret did required admitting that Beret had been right. And admitting Beret had been right required dismantling a structure he had spent 6 months building, the structure of opinion that said she was a fool. He came to Beret's shack after dark. He did not knock. He stood outside the door and waited until she opened it, and when she did, he stood in the cold with his collar up and his hat in his hands, and said he had a question about drainage. "What slope should a trench have?" Vale said. Beret looked at him. The lamplight caught the side of his face, and she could see the effort the question cost him, the muscles in his jaw working, the way his eyes stayed fixed on a point past her shoulder instead of meeting hers. This was a man dismantling himself one question at a time, and the dismantling was not graceful. She thought about what Ragnar would have done, and what Ragnar would have done was make him earn the answer the way everyone else had earned it, not by suffering, but by asking in public, in daylight, where the asking itself was the price. "Come back in the morning," Beret said. "Clegg will be here. Ask me then." Vale's jaw tightened. He understood what she was requiring. She was requiring him to ask for help from the woman he had tried to ruin, in front of the man whose respect he had spent a winter trying to turn against her. The asking would cost him more than the drainage would save him, measured in the only currency Vale truly valued, which was the appearance of authority. He could have refused. He could have walked away and patched his wall again, and paid for freight-grade lumber, and continued to calculate the cost of pride in board feet and barrel damage. But the calculation kept producing the same answer, and the answer kept being cheaper than the alternative. And Orson Vale was, beneath everything, a man who followed his numbers even when his numbers led him to a door he did not want to open. He came back in the morning. Clegg was there, as Beret had promised, repairing the stove collar with the new plate. Vale stood in the yard and asked his question again, and Beret answered it the same way she answered everyone. Drainage first, 1 inch per 6 feet, trench away from the wall, sod grass side down, pack in layers. She drew the cross-section in the dirt with a stick, the same way she had drawn it for Niels and Mercer and Peter and every other person who had come to her door since January. Vale watched the drawing take shape. He asked one more question. How deep should the banking go? To the base of the wall, Beret said. Earth does not protect what it does not touch. Clegg watched the exchange without speaking. When Vale left, Clegg said, He will do the trench. Yes, Beret said. He will not thank you. No. Clegg fit the stove plate into the firebox and tested the seal with his palm. No smoke. No leak. The stove drew clean for the first time since Beret had arrived on the claim, and the sound of the draft pulling through the pipe was a sound like a house breathing properly at last. He does not need to thank you, Clegg said. He needs to dig. Digging is enough. Thomas Bell arrived in April, following the telegraph line east from Rapid City with a spool of wire on his shoulder and a mule that carried tools. He was 33, a widower who had lost a wife to scarlet fever in Nebraska and come west because west was where the wires went, and the wires were what he knew. He was lean and quiet, with hands that were calloused in patterns Beret had never seen, not the broad palm calluses of a farmer or a digger, but narrow ridges on the fingers where wire had pressed and rubbed through leather gloves. He stopped at Beret's claim because the telegraph line crossed her property on a pole that had leaned 15 degrees in the January storm, and a leaning pole was a broken wire waiting to happen. He set the mule in the yard and walked to the pole and looked at it, then looked at the earthlock passage behind the shack, then looked at Beret, who was showing Niels how to seal a vent cap with tin and wire. He watched her teach for 5 minutes before speaking. He watched her hands, the way she bent the tin, the way she angled the wire through the cap holes, the way she made Niels do it himself instead of doing it for him. He watched the way Niels listened, which was the way a man listens to someone he has decided to trust, leaning forward slightly, hands still, questions forming behind his eyes before they reached his mouth. Who taught you to build that? Thomas said, nodding toward the earthlock. A woman named Ragna Lund, Beret said. She's buried on the hill. Thomas looked at the hill. He looked at the passage. He looked at the drainage trench, the sod cap, the vent shaft. He was a man who worked with systems, wire and current and poles and insulators, each piece depending on every other piece, and he recognized a system when he saw one. The pole needs resetting, he said. I can do it today if you have a post hole digger. I have a pickaxe, Beret said. That will do. He reset the pole. Beret helped him tamp the base, and they worked in the easy silence of people who understand that conversation is not required when the work itself is speaking. When the pole was straight and the wire was tight, Thomas walked to the earth lock and asked if he could see inside. Beret showed him. She showed him the way she showed everyone: the arch, the crib, the drainage, the vent, the second door, the clay wall that held yesterday. Thomas touched the wall the way every person who entered the chamber touched the wall, palm flat, testing for something the hand could feel and the mind could not name. How deep is the bank above you? He said. 6 feet at the center, 8 at the back. And the temperature stays constant? It holds the day before, sometimes 2 days before. When the air drops fast, the clay drops slow. Thomas nodded. He understood insulation the way a telegraph man understands it, as a barrier between what you want to keep and what wants to take it. Wire wrapped in gutta percha held its signal. A house wrapped in earth held its heat. The principle was the same, separated only by material and scale. He came back the next week with hinges, not as a gift, not as courtship, but as a practical observation. Beret's inner door hung on leather straps that would rot by summer, and iron hinges would last 10 years. He also brought a better stove collar, one that fit the new plate Clegg had installed, and news from the telegraph office about weather patterns moving east. Beret tested him. She said, "The drainage trench needs extending. The spring melt widened the channel, and the outlet is silting." Thomas looked at her. He understood the test. He was being asked to dig a ditch before he was allowed to admire the warm room, the same way Niels had been asked and Clegg had been asked, and every man who came to the earthlock was asked. The ditch was not hazing. The ditch was the first lesson, and a man who would not dig it was a man who had not learned it. Thomas took off his coat and picked up the shovel. He dug for 2 hours. The trench was muddy, and the work was cold, and the mule watched from the yard with the expression of an animal that has seen its owner do foolish things before. When Thomas finished, he cleaned the shovel and leaned it against the shack wall and asked if the chamber was warm enough for coffee. Beret laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since Ragna died, and the sound surprised her more than it surprised Thomas, who simply waited while the laughter finished and then followed her through the passage into the room that winter could not enter. Their courtship continued through spring and summer, built not on words, but on work rhythm. Thomas repaired the telegraph line between Rapid City and the settlements east. Beret taught earth sheltering to families who came from as far as 20 miles away, drawn by stories that had traveled the same telegraph line Thomas maintained. He brought news. She gave lessons. Both understood that survival on the plains was not a battle won once, but a maintenance performed daily, and that the people who lasted were not the strongest or the bravest, but the ones who understood that every system required attention: the wire, the wall, the trench, the vent, the stove, the cap. Thomas brought small things: a tin of grease for the inner door hinges, a roll of copper wire for patching the vent cap, a newspaper from Rapid City that described earth-sheltered construction in terms Beret did not recognize, thermal mass, conductive loss, air exchange rates, but that described exactly what she had built by feel and teaching and the memory of a mother's hand on a turf wall. He read the article aloud while Beret mended fence, and when he finished, she said, "They have long words for short work." Thomas laughed, and the laugh was the kind that comes from recognition, not amusement, the laugh of a man who has found someone who sees the same world he sees but from a different angle. He proposed in August, standing in the earth-lock passage, with his head bent under the arched ceiling, holding a stove collar fitting he had machined himself from scrap iron. It was not a ring. It was better than a ring. It was a piece of a system she needed, offered by a man who understood that need was more romantic than sentiment on the plains. Beret said yes. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without decoration, with the weight of a woman who had learned that words were most honest when they were shortest. They married in the spring of 1890, in a ceremony at the Spring Creek settlement that Clegg attended with his arms crossed, and Niels attended with his children, and Vail did not attend at all, though he sent a freight credit for 20 pounds of coal, which was the closest thing to a wedding gift a man like Vale could produce without admitting that the bride had beaten him. Beret and Thomas kept the original earth lock, but expanded the house around it, the way a settlement grows around a well. A proper sod-walled pantry replaced the hanging quilt at the passage entrance. A framed south room with glass windows let light into a house that had started as a tar paper box and grown into something that breathed with the land instead of fighting it. Thomas built a telegraph relay shelf in the south room, and in winter the clicking of the sounder mixed with the sound of the stove, drawing clean through the new plate and the silence of the earth lock behind the rear wall. They raised 2 children, a girl named Sigrid, born in 91, who inherited her mother's hands and her father's patience with systems. Sigrid could read clay by the time she was 10, pressing her thumb into a bank face and telling Beret whether it would hold or fall, and Beret watched her daughter's hands with the same quiet attention Ragna had once given to hers. A boy named Embret, born in 93, named for Ragna's dead husband because Beret believed that names carried knowledge the way earth carried warmth, slowly, invisibly, across time. Embret grew up in a house where the back wall was a hill, and the cellar was a passage, and the silence in the clayroom was the sound of safety, and he never questioned it because children do not question what they are born inside of. They took in Kittel Lunde for the winter of 91, while his ear healed badly, but his pride healed well. The ear lost its tip, a smooth scar that Kittel wore the rest of his life like a coin he had paid for something worth the price. He became a carpenter in Rapid City and built foundations that included drainage trenches whether the client asked for them or not, because Ragna had taught Beret, and Beret had taught Kittel, and Kittel could not look at a foundation without hearing the words, "Water is patient, more patient than cold." Clegg died in 1895 in his cabin, with enough wood stacked outside to last 3 winters. Before he died, he had taken to sending newcomers to Beret before selling them fuel. "Talk to the Vangen woman first," he told them. "She will save you money I cannot afford to lose." It was the closest Clegg ever came to saying he had been wrong, and it was close enough because on the plains a man's advice was his autobiography, and Clegg's final chapter directed people to the woman he had once told to sell her cow and pray. Niels became Beret's defender in the years that followed, the man who stood at the store and told other men, "Do the ditch first, or do not say you followed her." His sod house stood for 30 years with its banked north wall intact, and when his son rebuilt in frame lumber in 1908, the boy kept the earth banking on the north side because it was what he had grown up with and what he trusted, and trust built into a child's bones outlasts the arguments of men. Vale never apologized. He never converted in the way that stories require villains to convert. With a speech, a handshake, a moment of public surrender. What he did was bank the north side of his rebuilt freight barn with earth and sod, and a drainage trench sloped at 1 inch per 6 feet, and he did it without mentioning Beret's name, and everyone who saw it knew where the design came from, and no one said a word, because in a settlement where survival depended on shared knowledge, the knowledge mattered more than the credit. Vale died in 1903 in his freight barn, beside horses he had kept alive through winters by burning coal in a room that was finally banked against the wind. The drainage trench outside his north wall was clean and clear, sloped at 1 inch per 6 feet, exactly as Beret had taught. Beret never called the earth lock an invention. She called it the room that taught the house to wait. The phrase made no sense to people who had not spent a winter counting wood and watching frost grow inward through nail heads, but it made perfect sense to people who had, and those people were the only audience Beret cared about. Thomas once asked her to explain what she meant, and she said, "A house wants to lose its heat. It wants to give everything away through every crack and seam and nail hole. The room behind the house teaches it patience. The room says, hold what you have, do not spend it all at once. Wait." Thomas wrote the explanation in a letter to a friend in Nebraska, and the friend showed it to a man who wrote for a newspaper in Lincoln, and the man wrote a paragraph about a Norwegian widow in Dakota Territory who had survived the blizzard of '88 by digging into a hillside. The paragraph did not use Beret's name. It called her a resourceful settler. It did not mention Ragna Lund, or the crooked wrist, or the phrase water is patient, or the 5 rules, or the drainage trench that started everything. It reduced a life's work to a sentence, the way newspapers do, and Beret never saw it, and it did not matter, because the people who needed to know already knew, and they had learned it not from print, but from standing in a clay chamber with their palms against the wall, feeling the temperature of yesterday. By the following winter, 9 claims near Spring Creek had some form of earth-sheltered structure. 3 were banked entries like Beret's original design, short passages connecting existing shacks to the clay hills behind them, each one arched, cribbed, drained, and vented according to the sequence Beret insisted on. 2 were sod vestibules for families on sandy ground where tunneling risked collapse, above-ground windbreaks packed with earth on 3 sides and sealed with sod caps that shed water outward. 2 were root chambers tied to kitchen walls, dug into low banks just deep enough to keep potatoes and milk from freezing, with drain cuts that the owners cursed in October and blessed in March. 1 was a livestock shelter dug into a south-facing bluff by the Tolliver family, because after their boy nearly died against a haystack in the blizzard, they wanted their animals inside the same hill as their children. 1 was a combination cellar and windlock that a German-Russian family named Kessler built, using techniques they recognized from their own steppe traditions: deep vertical storage with a horizontal windbreak entry, married to Beret's drainage and venting principles, creating something that neither tradition would have produced alone. Each one was different. Each one followed the same 5 rules: drain first, arch the load, crib the roof, vent the air, seal the cap. The rules were Ragna's. The teaching was Beret's. The structures belonged to the people who dug them, and the digging was the price of admission to knowledge that no store sold and no freight wagon delivered. Beret kept a ledger, not of debts or credits, but of what worked and what failed and why. Clay bank, sod cap, drain clear, vent angled, no straight cuts, no wet bank. She recorded the slope of each trench, the thickness of each sod cap, the species of timber used for cribbing, and the date of each inspection when she walked the structures after storms and thaws to check for settling and seepage. She wrote in pencil on brown paper, in Norwegian, because Norwegian was the language her hands thought in, and her mother had spoken, and the words looked right in the letters she had learned in a schoolroom 3,000 miles and 20 years away. Beret Vangen Bell died in 1927 in the house that had grown around the original earthlock the way a tree grows around a fence post. She was 68. Frame houses and coal stoves and better rail service had changed the settlement beyond recognition, and the dugouts and sod houses that had kept the first generation alive were mostly filled in or fallen, remembered as hardship rather than engineering. In her last winter, she asked Thomas to help her to the old rear door, the inner door of the original passage, now deep inside a larger house, sealed shut for years, its frame darkened by decades of stove smoke and cooking grease. Thomas opened it. The passage beyond was collapsed at the far end where the chamber roof had finally given way to time, but the first 6 feet still held, the arch ceiling intact, the clay walls cool and smooth under Beret's hand. She sat in a chair by the open door and listened to wind fail against the bank, the same bank she had cut into with a pickaxe 40 years earlier, while her ribs ached and her neighbors laughed and a woman with a crooked wrist told her that clay does not hang. Clay leans. She died in February, in the south room Thomas had built, with Sigrid holding one hand and Embret holding the other, the same way Ragna had died 39 years before. The stove drew clean. The wind pressed against the north wall and found nothing to enter. The earth lock, half collapsed, half standing, held the temperature of the day before, as it always had, as it always would, until the last pole cracked and the hill reclaimed what Beret had borrowed. By the second winter after the blizzard of 1888, 9 families near Spring Creek had built some form of earth-sheltered structure based on what Beret Vangen taught them. Abner Clegg, who had once measured her survival in cords of wood she did not have, sent every newcomer to her door before he would sell them fuel. He told them, "Talk to her first. She will save you money I cannot afford to lose." Beret Vangen Bell lived out her life on the Spring Creek claim. The original 9-foot passage remained behind the house, long after coal stoves and rail freight made it unnecessary for survival. Children stored apples in the chamber. Crocks of milk sat against the clay wall in summer, cool as autumn. Ragna Lunde's auger peg hung above the inner door, not as decoration, but as a reminder that knowledge is a tool passed hand to hand, and the hand that receives it owes nothing except to pass it again. They had laughed at her in the store. They had called it a grave. They had stood by the stove with their hands warm and their opinions loud and said she was digging her own burial. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped and the wind drove snow through every plank wall in the settlement, and a boy nearly died against a haystack, and a cow nearly died in a lean-to, and men burned through a week of fuel in a single night. Beret Vangen burned twigs and scrub in a shack, backed by 9 feet of clay and sod and silence, and the water in her crocks did not freeze, and the wall behind her held the day before, and the day before that. The grave they laughed at became the first room winter could not enter.